This is mostly a test live as I'm streaming from desktop, which is brand new on Substack. So I would love to know how it sounds, how it looks. Do you notice anything weird, any sound issues or anything? I'm going live a few times later this month with Mariana Lewis. Next week, we're going to be talking about tarot and her new book. And then later in the month, we're also going to go live for a members kind of like tarot oracle reading. So this is my test live today. So let me know your comments, feedback, and also maybe say hello as you join. Um, so based on the title of this live, I did want to chat a little bit about the the book Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is Jung's autobiography. But the qualifier there is it's a sort of semi-autobiographical text. And that Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which I'll show you here, I have actually a hard copy, a hardcover copy. I got this used probably in Berkeley, California. So it doesn't have a dust cover or anything like that. But otherwise, the main copy that I tend to see around is like this mass produced paperback, which is super small. I actually don't have it anymore. I think when I got the hardcover one, but it's sort of similar to like this is Man and His Symbols, but it's the Memories, Dreams, Reflections paperback is sort of similar, which is like it's pretty small and you're reading teeny tiny little text. And so when I saw the hardcover of this one, I had to have it because it's beautiful. I love vintage books, but it's also much easier to read. So I'll just show you guys the opening pages here. Big picture of Jung there. So as I was saying, this book is semi-autobiographical, which is to say Jung actually did not write it himself. It's made up of a series of interviews with Amelia Yaffe, who was a very close contributor and an incredible thinker in her own right in the Jungian world at that time. And so a series of interviews took place where Jung went deep into his childhood memories, into the years with Freud, into his work. He talks a lot about his dreams, different visions, different reflections on his travels. And those series of interviews is actually what made up the book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. So because it's not necessarily a classic autobiography, there's this kind of disconnect between the interviews themselves and then what was put in the book. And this has been talked about for a long time, in the Jungian world, if you're plugged into that, that the book itself, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, was fairly, how do I say this? Like it was edited, it was censored a bit. My understanding is that Jung wanted to be very forthright and very honest, but all the things that he shared at that time, which is, just a few years before his death, were things that they weren't fully comfortable with putting in. And so the end product, although I think it likely has a lot of authenticity and sticks fairly true to what Jung was saying, there's a lot that was left out. And in the last few years, the Philemon Foundation, which I believe is a nonprofit of a kind of group of individuals who are kind of going back into Jung's writing and re-releasing or releasing brand new books that give us more of an authentic take on Jung's work. So some of that, in the case of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, is the actual interviews that made up the autobiography. So this was just released here in America, at least. This came out on December 2nd, so 4 days ago, and it's all of the original interviews that make up this book. I've yet to dive into it. I'll show you to you guys a little bit. What I find a little bit annoying, just taking a look at it so far, is that the book is not structured the way Memories, Dreams, Reflections is, which is to say, each kind of chapter or section of Memories, Dreams, Reflections is thematically categorized by, I'll show it to you here. So we have Jung's first years, we have his school years, student years, psychiatric activities, Sigmund Freud, confrontation with the unconscious, the work, the tower, travels, visions on life after death, and late thoughts. Those are all like the main sections of the book. And then in Jung's life and work, the original interviews, it's not broken into those sections. And I really wish it was, probably because they weren't sequential in how they were recording all of these interviews, but I feel like it might make it a little bit difficult to compare one section from memories, dreams, reflections to the actual original material. So what you essentially have is a chronological um movement from it seems 1957 in January to 1958 in September, and all the interviews moving chronologically. So that's a little bit unfortunate. Once I dive into it more, maybe I'll get a better sense or an orientation of the book. But either way, it's very exciting for us to have the book, and to be able to really compare what was Jung saying, what was he sharing in these original interviews, and what ended up in the published book itself. So it's a very fascinating um, release. And I highly recommend checking out the Philemon Foundation because they're putting out such interesting work. One thing I'm really looking forward to is a book on alchemy, like an unreleased book on alchemy that was kind of in Jung's like papers and things like that. I have several books. Let me just grab a few of them since I'm here. Um, let's see. Okay. So like this is from the Philemon Foundation. So we have an introduction to Jungian psychology, and these are notes on a seminar that was given in 1925. Um, that's not Philemon. There's one other one that I really love. Where is it? I have too many books, guys. Can't find what I'm looking for. Here's another one. Here's another one. Okay, this is on a discussion on psychological types that was between Jung and another individual. So, anyways, there's just all of these new publications coming out. And, if you're familiar with Jung's writing or the books that we do have access to, it's mostly the collected works, which were translations from German, which I've also heard that there was kind of like a lot left on the editing table between the German version and the English versions, things like that. So, anyways, check out the Philemon Foundation and all the new books on Jung that they are releasing. They are super fascinating. It's like, the exciting next step in, Jungian thought that we have. And it's all coming from the Philemon Foundation. Anywho, as I was saying, this month in the Artemisians membership, we're doing a read along of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I'm calling it a gentle read along because what I tend to find with sort of book club style gatherings and events and things like that is everybody moves at such a different pace. And unless you have a few months to cover a book, a lot of times it's just too much to try and squeeze all of that into a month's time or less. And so really the point of this month's inner work theme and the focusing of the book is to just inspire curiosity into this text because it is, in my opinion, one of the most accessible Jungian texts that we have. Um, I think Jung's writing is notoriously academic, dense, very hard to understand. It's because it was written for other people in the field. It was not written for the everyday individual. So, Man and His Symbols was a book that was written for the everyday person. So that's a great book. And then Memories, Dreams, Reflections is of course recorded and then edited in this style of just Jung talking about his life. So it's not heavily full of all of this jargon and super academic and trying to, prove these points to colleagues in his field. It is a much more grounded exploration of Jung's work and his experiences. And for that reason, I always recommend it as one of the first books to begin with. I just think it's It's super accessible and it's fascinating because you really get a deeper insight into who he is, what kind of inspired his work. I call it like the mythic origins of Jung. So I wanted to just read a couple of passages from it to give you a sense of the book because there's a lot here. There's so many interesting chapters. I think things especially start to get fascinating to me as we get into his university work and his time with Freud and the confrontations that came from the unconscious. Um, it's interesting to see how he chose his path with his studies, what inspired him, the tensions there, his meeting with Freud, and what sort of began to pull them apart. It's more than you'll ever get in the collected works since that was more theoretical. So this is like the true sort of personal telling of Jung's life. Okay. So I'm opening up to confrontations with the unconscious, and this section of the book covers what happened to Jung after he broke from Freud. So the chapter before this talks about their meeting, how Jung was beginning to read Freud's work even before he met him, how psychoanalysis was helping him make sense of the work he was doing as a psychiatrist, especially with patients that were dealing with a lot of schizophrenia. His interest in dreams and how, Freud's ideas really began to give him a theoretical ground and framework to understand dreams. But the more that he got involved with Freud and psychoanalysis, the more he felt this kind of divergence that he didn't align fully with Freud's theories on, the main kind of, psychological urge and dynamics within the psyche are all sexual in nature, or that dreams are a kind of sensor of sleep. All of these things he was feeling a pull away from. And on the flip side, Freud kind of was looking at Jung as like the crown prince of psychoanalysis or the heir apparent. And so their break, which had been based on several years of a very close relationship. I think Jung was even like the president of like the psychoanalytic community or something like that, was devastating, even though he sort of did it by his own hand. He stepped away from Freud. But what it did was it created an incredible disorientation and upheaval in his life and began this period of confrontations with the unconscious, which were especially marked by these visions that he would have. Some of those would kind of come on him spontaneously as he was living his everyday life. And then some of them were the basis of intentional active imaginations that he was doing. And all of that material is what makes up the red book or the black books, if you have those. So this section, the confrontation with the unconscious, explores that. So I'm just going to read the first paragraph here. He says, after the parting of the ways with Freud, a period of inner uncertainty began for me. It would be no exaggeration to call it a state of disorientation. I felt totally suspended in midair, for I had not yet found my own footing. Above all, I felt it necessary to develop a new attitude toward my patients. I resolved for the present not to bring any theoretical premises to bear upon them, but to wait and see what they would tell of their own accord. My aim became to leave things to chance. The result was that the patients would spontaneously report their dreams and fantasies to me, and I would merely ask, what occurs to you in connection with that? Or, how do you mean that? Where does that come from? What do you think about it? The interpretations seemed to follow of their own accord from the patient's replies and associations. I avoided all theoretical points of view and simply helped the patients to understand the dream images by themselves without application of rules and theories. So this little part is interesting to me because previous to this, if he was operating from, Freud's framework and a psychoanalytic point of view, as a patient shares a dream, you're already sort of searching for, how does this depict, an Oedipal complex, or how is this showing, the movement of the repressed sexual libido? You're coming in with these preconceived notions of what's happening within an individual psyche. And his break from Freud allowed him to take this like theoretical step, this embodied practical step back and to begin to approach dreams in a new way. And by leaving it up to the dreamer to kind of begin to associate or to connect it to something within themselves, what that image reminded them of, or what it brought up in the moment. It began to unveil this deeper relationship to their own unconscious. And that's a big part of Jungian dream work. We kind of move through different levels of interpretation of what does this bring up for you personally? What might it represent culturally? Or when all of those are exhausted, we move into the archetypal level of association, which of course is a purely Jungian addition to dream work, which is to say, what is the kind of thread of the collective unconscious or that foundational psychological layer that might be appearing? What kind of archetype is expressing itself through a dream? So his break with Freud, allowed him to begin to shift, his work in a major way. But it also began to create all this intensity and all of this kind of overwhelm. I think this happens when we have a shakeup in life or we feel like there's some sort of really deep confrontation, perhaps something we would call like, a midlife crisis or a quarter life crisis, where suddenly everything you had known has changed. All of that's gone away. Like it's a tower moment, right? And there's some interesting parts of this section where he talks about experiencing that overwhelm and how intense it was for him. So I just want to read a little section of that. He says, I was frequently so wrought up that I had to do certain yoga exercises in order to hold my emotions in check. But since it was my purpose to know what was going on within myself, I would do these exercises only until I had calmed myself enough to resume my work with the unconscious. As soon as I had the feeling that I was myself again, I abandoned this restraint upon the emotions and allowed the images and inner voices to speak afresh. I think this is really cool because I've never read anywhere else in Jung's work that he utilized any kind of yogic exercises. I don't know if those were physical exercises or kind of like a breathwork pranayama. But when I read this years ago, and I wrote about this just in the Oracle I released a few days ago, it was really amazing to me because my own inner work that I had been doing for several years, which I would say was my own confrontation with the unconscious, caused a ton of instability, kind of aligned at a time when I was deepening a physical practice of yoga. And that was my lifeline. It kind of tethered me or anchored me back into the body, which I realized was such an important part of my inner work, especially as an intuitive type. Like I'm very in the clouds, where I'm in this kind of dream world. I suppress like the sensate experience and the body, and I disconnect from it very readily. And so learning to tune back into the body and to have a physical practice, and not just one of yoga, but one that extended into like this development of like a love of hiking and backpacking and cooking and growing my own food. It's like all these very sensate dynamics that completely grounded my life in a new way. So it's like really cool for me to read that in Jung's work, that he sort of, I don't know, went through something similar as that. So that was very cool. Okay, there was one other little part I wanted to read, and I've somehow lost it. So let me see if I can find it. It's in the On Life After Death section, which is both some personal reflections and sharing and sort of visions that Jung has had. He had a near-death experience when I think it was like a heart attack. Can't remember because I haven't reread that part yet. And it's, one thing about Jung's work is that he practiced and wrote over such a long period of time that depending on when you read his work, whether it's like 1920s Jung or 1950s Jung or earlier, later than that, you see these evolutions in his thought. And I think sometimes that can be frustrating to people because it's like Jung talks about archetypes in 10 different ways and which one's right. And it's like, well, you're seeing him thinking out loud through his writings. You're seeing the evolution of his thought. And one way that he originally approached these kind of paranormal or parapsychological phenomena and the occult in the very early days. He did actually his dissertation on his cousin who was a medium, and he attended seances and then wrote like a psychological interpretation of what he thought was going on, as he mostly sort of attributes that to these autonomous complexes that are coming out in an individual that have a voice and have something to say, and people are sort of moving the ego aside and allowing those to filter in. But towards the end of his life, I think he begins to take a much more, I don't know how to say this, but it's sort of like the mystery of the unknown, the mystery of death, the mystery of the paranormal experiences was not something that he could fully figure out and put a theoretical basis to. And I think he begins to hold more and more of that mystery the older that he gets. And so his ideas on, like the phenomena of ghosts or of prophetic dreams, also of synchronicity, all of that really begins to change. And he's not necessarily attributing it just only to this like one psychological phenomena. It's kind of like the blending of realities and this sort of liminal realm that we don't fully understand. Anyways, this part is him talking about a kind of vision that he had after the death of a friend or like a neighbor. So let me see if I can find it because I just lost it. Um, okay, let's see. Where did it go? Let's see. Okay, here it is. So he says, one night I lay awake thinking of the sudden death of a friend whose funeral had taken place the day before. I was deeply concerned. Suddenly I felt that he was in the room. It seemed to me that he stood at the foot of my bed and was asking me to go with him. I did not have the feeling of an apparition. Rather, it was an inner visual image of him, which I explained to myself as a fantasy. But in all honesty, I had to ask myself, do I have any proof that this is a fantasy? Suppose it is not a fantasy. Suppose my friend is really here and I decided he was only a fantasy. Would that not be abominable of me? Yet I had equally little proof that he stood before me as an apparition. Then I said to myself, proof is neither here nor there. Instead of explaining him away as a fantasy, I might just as well give him the benefit of the doubt and for experiment's sake, credit him with reality. The moment I had thought that, he went to the door and beckoned me to follow him. So I was going to have to play along with him. That was something I hadn't bargained for. I had to repeat my argument to myself once more. Only then did I follow him in my imagination. So he's having this kind of paranormal experience, sort of seeing this friend who's deceased as a kind of inner image. And I think if you're anyone who's had experiences like this, that you don't often actually see the vision or the fantasy or this, strange thing in actual reality, but it's like a sensing an inner vision, an imaginal experience, and yet the reality of it feels undeniable. So that's kind of what Jung's going through right now. Anyway, so in his imagination, the friend is leading him. He says, he led me out of the house, into the garden, and out to the road, and finally to his house. In reality, it was several hundred yards away from mine. I went in and he conducted me into his study. He climbed on a stool and showed me the second of 5 books with red bindings, which stood on the second shelf from the top. Then the vision broke off. I was not acquainted with his library and did not know what books he owned. Certainly, I could never have made out from below the titles of the books he had pointed out to me on the second shelf from the top. This experience seemed to me so curious that next morning I went to his widow and asked whether I could look up something in my friend's library. Sure enough, there was a stool standing under the bookcase I had seen in my vision. And even before I came closer, I could see the 5 books with red bindings. I stepped up on the stool so as to be able to read the titles. They were translation of the novels of Emile Zola. The title of the second volume read The Legacy of the Dead. The content seemed to me of no interest, only the title was extremely significant in connection with this experience. So there's one of Jung's kind of life after death experiences. So you get all of these really fascinating tellings of his life, things that, as I mentioned, you would probably not find in the collected works. They're much more personal in nature. And what I think it ultimately does is help us understand his theoretical work and his academic work better because we understand what drove him, what inspired him, the dreams that changed him, the emotions that he was going through. This, we get this too with the Red Book, which that time of the confrontation with the unconscious became like the generative ground, the generative psychic ground that he was beginning to uncover what would eventually be analytical psychology or Jungian psychology. So, anyways, if you're curious about diving into memories, dreams, reflections this month, we're doing that in the membership here in the Artemisian. We're doing a very gentle read along, and then we're going to have a workshop on the solstice where I'm going to cover major themes of the book, and we're going to talk how they relate back to core Jungian principles. So, I would love for you to join us if you're interested. And really quickly, before I hop off, later this month, I'm going to be going live for members to do this kind of paired tarot and oracle readings. And I'm going to be using the Supra Oracle, which is a deck by the publisher Usi. And it's a Jungian inspired oracle deck. And it kind of blends Gnosticism and Jungian thought. It's a really beautiful deck. So I'm not really a big fan of oracle decks usually. There's like a few of them that I really, really love, but especially with this one, tapping into some core Jungian ideas, but also, other like general spiritual concepts. I think it pairs really beautifully with tarot, or as a standalone. So as an example, here's unconscious. Oh, wait, no, that's imagination. Here is the card of imagination. And here's the unconscious. Here's ego, which is almost like this very like Icarus image, the kind of falling wings, magic, kind of more of a Gnostic theme there. Gentleness, self, very cool. Anyways, I thought I might like demo the deck for a moment. If someone has an inquiry, the same thing you would ask, for a tarot question, an inner work related question, I'll pull a card and show you how the deck is used. But definitely tune in a couple of weeks when I do the tarot and Usi blend together, because that should be really, really fun. So, anyways, if you have an inner work question, something kind of open ended that you want me to pull a card on, drop it and I will choose one, and then I'll draw a card and I'll just show you some more, because I think so. These go over the 4 cognitive functions. Intuition, very cool. Here's feeling. And each of them, they pair up together to make a kind of labyrinth image. Super pretty. Here's one that's cool. Myth. I haven't heard of any other Jungian related oracle decks. There is a Jungian tarot deck, but in terms of a Jungian related oracle one, this is the only one that I know of. So, anyways, if someone has an inquiry or a question, I'll pull a card, and if not, then I'll hop off, and that'll be the end of today's little live stream. And once again, I'll just show the books I was referencing. Jung's Life and Work. This is the original interviews and the protocol that make up Memory Dreams Reflections. And then the hardcover edition that I have of Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a vintage copy. Oh, what deck is that? Let me show you. This is the Supra Oracle by a publisher called Usi, Uusi. They also created a oracle deck based on the periodic table called Materia Prima. So not to be confused with an alchemy deck. It's not a deck on alchemy. Maybe I'll pull out some of these cards because they're super cool. They're very beautiful. I also have foiled versions. Like here's nitrogen. I don't use this deck. I just find it beautiful. Maybe if I had more of a background in chemistry. I do have the guidebook, but it doesn't speak to me as intuitively because I don't know the periodic table. It's really pretty. So Usi created the Materia Prima. They created a tarot deck called Pagan Otherworlds, sort of like a Rider-Waite / Marseille blended together. So the publisher is just incredible. I love the decks that they make. Okay, well, it doesn't look like anybody has a question. Perhaps I'll just demonstrate it myself so you guys can get a sense. Oh, Rob dropped one. Will I recover? Oh, that's a heavy. That's a heavy inquiry. So my heart goes out to you wherever you're at with that, Rob. Okay, so I'm just shuffling through, and I pull my cards this way. I do overhanded shuffling until a card pops out. Sincerity. It's a really interesting. A lot of these cards are very simple, and the kind of mostly black and white coloring of it, I think, makes it just really refined. The black space to me, I'm really drawn to the black space in this card of sincerity. But when I think about what this might mean for you in terms of recovery from something, um, sincerity first and foremost feels like an inner means of touching into that part of self that feels wounded. There's a connection here between two aspects. And if we take this maybe more concretely or literally, perhaps sincerity can come from outer resources. Those can that can kind of gentle the storm or offer a sincere resource or ear or support through this time. But being that this is a Jungian Gnostic inspired deck, it makes me think about the internal experience first and foremost, and being able to come into relationship with the parts that feel the parts that feel that they've been hurt, or the parts that feel as if they've been wounded beyond a degree, or the parts that feel I don't know, like uncoverable. And so that sincerity feels like a gentleness towards oneself, because oftentimes when there is something within us that we need to recover from, whether it's the loss of a relationship, the death of somebody, your work falling apart, an internal breakdown, there's, I think, a sense of alienation from those parts of ourselves, and this feeling of I don't know how to reconnect to it. And oftentimes recovery is sort of like the rebuilding of those foundations. So to me, sincerity would be guiding you to try to kind of open that door or extend that hand back out to those parts that feel the wound, so that it can integrate back into life, um, in a way that doesn't bypass what happened, but actually allows their story, their wounds, their pains to be heard. Because I think that's the only way to truly release that kind of intense charge, or to feel that there's a profound healing or movement forward. Its story has to be heard, its wounds need to be tended to. And I think that whatever feels wounded in here, it needs gentleness, it needs sincerity, it needs understanding, it needs more of a calmness, not, hey, you should get it together, you should be healed. It doesn't need a forcefulness, it needs a gentle approach. So anyways, that's from the Usi Supra Oracle, and I'll be drawing more of these cards later this month for members' archetypal guidance readings. Okay, that's our time. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Hopefully, streaming on my desktop here worked out well. I'm going to review it. I'll post it on my website later. And yeah, I'll probably go live again next week too. So feel free to check out what's coming up over on the artemisian.com. Join us in the membership if you'd like to read memories, dreams, reflections with us, and attend our workshop gathering. And that's it. Okay. Bye, everyone.